The officer had his knee on the man's back at 9:07 p.m. on a Wednesday, on the ground floor corridor of Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital in Accra, Ghana, 43 feet from the elevator bank, while a nurse named Sister Agnes stood at the nursing station with both hands pressed flat against the counter and did not move. The man on the ground was wearing scrubs, dark green, the shade that the surgical unit used, with a white coat over them that had his name embroidered above the left breast pocket in navy blue thread, and that had been laundered that morning at 6 a.m. and that was now pressed against the linoleum floor of the corridor alongside the rest of him. His glasses had come off when the officer put him down. They were lying 3 feet away near the baseboard. One lens cracked along the lower right corner, which was going to cost 240 cedis to replace, in which he was not thinking about at this moment because he was thinking about the man on the fourth floor who had a clot in his left middle cerebral artery and who had been in surgery for 4 hours and 17 minutes, and who was now in the ICU, and who was going to need a decision made about his anticoagulation protocol in the next 38 minutes by a physician who was currently face down on a hospital corridor floor. His name was Dr. Kofi Mensah Owusu. He was 44 years old, 168 pounds, and he had been the chief of neurology at Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital for 7 years. He had trained at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, completed his residency at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and returned to Ghana in 2009 because he had told his mother he would come back. And he had come back and he had not regretted it, except on occasional Tuesdays when the equipment broke. And on one Wednesday, when he was face down on a linoleum floor, 43 feet from the elevator bank. The white coat he wore had his name embroidered above the left breast pocket, in navy blue thread, by a seamstress on Oxford Street in Osu, who had embroidered the coats of the surgical unit for 11 years and who charged 15 cedis per name, and who always added a small anchor stitch at the end of the last letter that was not visible to anyone who was not looking for it. His late father had been a school teacher in Kumasi who had kept a copy of Gray's Anatomy on the shelf above his desk, for reasons he never fully explained, and who had died in 1997 of a ruptured aneurysm before the paramedics could get him to hospital. And it was this specific fact, the speed of the thing, the 40-minute drive, the arriving too late, that had oriented Kofi Mensah Owusu toward neurology and away from everything else. He carried a stethoscope in his right coat pocket that had been his father's, a Littmann cardiology tree that his mother had given him when he graduated from KAST in 1998, the rubber worn at the earpiece tips, the chess piece polished from 2 decades of use to a brightness that was different from new polish, that was the brightness of a thing that had been held often by a person who meant something to you. It had been paged at 8:51 p.m. and he had come. It had been summoned from the surgical theater at 8:51 p.m. by a page from the ICU charge nurse, Sister Adwa, who had written 5 words on the message: "Come now, 4th floor, critical." He had walked out of the theater at 8:53 p.m., still in his scrubs, with his white coat half on, left sleeve trailing, and had come down the corridor at the pace of a man who knew the difference between a pace that kept him functional and a run that would have him shaking when he needed his hands still. At 9:04 p.m., he had been stopped in the corridor by a security officer named Emmanuel Asafu Adhe, who worked the overnight shift for Premier Security Services, a private contractor hired by the hospital to manage access controls since the renovation of 2021. Emmanuel was 27 years old, 4 months on the job, with a uniform that was 1 size too large at the shoulders, and a radio that worked intermittently, and a mandate that said he was responsible for confirming the identity of all personnel moving through the restricted corridor after 9 p.m. on weeknights. Emmanuel had stopped Dr. Mensah Owusu and asked for his identification badge. The doctor had said he was the chief of neurology, and he had a critical patient on the 4th floor. Emmanuel had said he needed the badge before he could allow access. The doctor had reached into his white coat pocket and found it empty. The badge was on his other coat, the one hanging in his office on the 4th floor, to which he was trying to get through the corridor that Emmanuel was standing in. He said this. Emmanuel sighed he could not allow access without the badge. The corridor at 9:05 p.m. had a quality of sound specific to hospitals at this hour. Not silence, but a reduced noise, a compression of the building's usual activity into something quieter and more deliberate. The overhead lights in this section ran at 70% after 9 p.m. to reduce visual disruption for patients whose rooms opened onto the corridor, which gave the floor a slightly amber quality, a warmth that belonged to the wrong context. Somewhere on the second floor, a monitor was beeping at the steady interval that meant stable. Somewhere outside, through the windows at the far end of the corridor, the sound of Accra at night. Traffic on the Gugisberg Avenue Ring Road. A horn somewhere distant. The low continuous sound of a city that did not stop being a city while a hospital tried to keep people alive inside it. Emmanuel was following the protocol. The protocol SIP badge. He had been given the protocol on his first day, laminated in a plastic sleeve, alongside a copy of the access map and the radio charging schedule and the name of the day supervisor to call if something did not fit the protocol. He had the protocol. The protocol did not have a section for what happened when the person in front of you had a patient dying upstairs and no badge in their pocket and a face that was telling you something the protocol could not translate. It was 27 years old. He had been on this job for 4 months. The doctor said he was willing to be escorted to his office to retrieve it if Emmanuel wanted confirmation. Boot that they needed to move because a man on the 4th floor was running out of a window he had been counting on since 8:51. Emmanuel said it was against protocol. The doctor stepped forward. Emmanuel put him on the ground. There were 3 other people in the corridor. Sister Agnes at the nursing station who had pressed her hands flat on the counter. A night porter named Ya, who had stopped his cleaning cart 6 meters away and stood very still. And a woman named Mrs. Nana Darko Mensah, 58 years old, who had come downstairs from the 4th floor family waiting area to find coffee and who had been standing at the corridor entrance when Emmanuel Asafu Adhei put the chief of neurology of Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital face down on the linoleum at 9:07 p.m. Mrs. Darko Mensah did not go for coffee. She turned around and went back up the stairs. If this story is settling somewhere specific in your body right now, stay with me, because Mrs. Darko Mensah is not a bystander. She is the hinge point of everything that happens next. And she has been in this hospital for 11 hours because the man on the 4th floor is her husband. Dr. Mensah Owusu had operated on the man on the 4th floor 4 hours and 17 minutes ago. The man's name was Governor Kwadwo Achiampong Boaten. He was 62 years old, the elected governor of the Greater Accra region, and had been brought to Korle-Bu at 4:18 p.m. by ambulance after collapsing at a constituency meeting in cantonments with a presenting symptom that his aide, who had ridden in the ambulance, described as the right side of his face stopped working. The aide had described this correctly. The right side of his face had stopped working because the left middle cerebral artery was in the process of being blocked by a clot the size of a grain of maize, and the 90-minute treatment window for thrombolytic therapy had closed at 5:48 p.m. And Dr. Mensah Owusu had performed a mechanical thrombectomy that had taken 4 hours and 17 minutes, and that had removed the clot and restored perfusion to the affected territory, and that, in the estimation of the surgical team, given the governor a 70 to 80% chance of full functional recovery. The doctor had not known who the patient was when he opened the chart. It had known he was a 62-year-old male with a left MCA occlusion and a 4-hour-old deficit and a window that was already narrowing and a wife in the 4th floor waiting room who had been told to wait. He had known these things and he had operated on these things, and the anticoagulation protocol decision that was now 36 minutes away was a decision about these things: the clot, the artery, the tissue, the recovery, and not about the name on the chart, because the name on the chart did not change what the tissue needed. He knew all of this face down on the linoleum. What he also knew, face down on the linoleum, was that the corridor floor smelled of the disinfectant the hospital used on Mondays and Wednesdays, and that there was a hairline crack in the tile 3 inches from his left eye that had been there since at least 2017, because he had walked this corridor for 7 years, and he had noticed it before and had thought about reporting it, and had not reported it, and was now looking at it. From a distance of 3 inches with his hands palm down on either side of his head and his glasses 3 feet away near the baseboard, with 1 cracked lens and 35 minutes remaining in the anticoagulation window. Sister Agnes, at the nursing station, had not moved. Ya, with the cleaning cart, had not moved. Mrs. Darko Mensah had gone up the stairs. Emmanuel Asafu Adhei was saying something about protocol. The doctor said from the floor, in a voice that was entirely level, "You need to let me up. There is a patient dying on the fourth floor. I am the physician responsible for that patient. You have 34 minutes to decide whether the protocol was worth it." Emmanuel said he was sorry, but he needed the badge. The doctor said, "Then escort me." There was a pause. The corridor hummed with the specific sound of a hospital at 9 p.m. The ventilation system, the distant sound of a monitor somewhere on a ward, the elevator mechanism somewhere above them, a sound like the building was breathing slowly and not particularly interested in what was happening at floor level. Sister Agnes, at the nursing station, had pressed her hands flat on the counter when it happened and had kept them there for 47 seconds. She was 38 years old, and she had been a nurse at Corlebu for 12 years, and she had been in this corridor at the end of enough difficult shifts to know that the correct response to something like this was not always obvious and that the incorrect response could follow you. She had her phone on the counter in front of her. She had looked at it. She had not picked it up. At 9:09 p.m., she picked it up. She dialed the extension for the fourth floor charge nursing station, where Sister Adwa was watching the governor's chart and watching the clock on the wall above the monitors, and had been watching both since the page went out at 8:51 p.m. with no answer yet. From the corridor, Sister Agnes said 4 words. "He is being held." Sister Adwa said 3. "By whom? Why?" Sister Agnes said, "Security. No badge." The line was quiet for 2 seconds. Then Sister Adwa said, "Find the deputy governor. He is in the family room. Tell him directly." She had sent Mrs. Darko Mensa downstairs for coffee 22 minutes earlier because the woman had not eaten since noon and was starting to have the particular look of someone who was going to help nobody, including herself, if she did not eat something. She had not anticipated that sending her downstairs would mean sending her directly into the corridor at the moment the chief of neurology went face down on the floor. But that was how it had worked. The corridor had been 43 feet from where it needed to be, and Mrs. Darko Mensa had been in the corridor, and she had turned around and gone back up the stairs. And the stairs had led to the family room, and the family room had the deputy governor in it. The chain was not elegant. It was the chain that was available at 9:08 p.m. at Corlebu Teaching Hospital. Assembled in 4 minutes out of a nurse, with a phone and a wife going for coffee, and a second nurse who knew that a problem you could see was a problem you could solve if you moved before it moved. Past you. Then the elevator opened. The man who walked out was not tall. He was 56 years old, slightly built, in a dark suit with no tie and a face that carried the specific quality of someone who had been managing a crisis for several hours already and had just upgraded the crisis. His name was Deputy Governor Nanao Foriata. He had received a call on his way from the governor's bedside to the parking structure from Mrs. Darko Mensa, the governor's wife, who had used 7 words, "Your chief doctor is on the floor." He had taken 7 seconds to understand those words, and then he had turned around and gotten back into the elevator. He walked out of the elevator at 9:11 p.m. and looked at the corridor and saw Dr. Mensa Awusu on the floor and Emmanuel Asafu Adhei standing over him and Sister Agnes at the nursing station, with her hands flat on the counter and Ja with his cleaning cart, and he stood very still for 2 seconds in the way of a person who is reading a situation before they respond to it. He sighed to Emmanuel, "Step back." Emmanuel looked at him. "Now," the deputy governor said. The word did not rise. It did not fall. It landed flat and complete, the way a word lands when the person saying it has not had to raise their voice in a very long time, because they have not needed to. Emmanuel stepped back. Dr. Mensa Uso got to his feet. He picked up his glasses from the floor near the baseboard. He looked at the cracked lens. He put them on anyway. He smoothed the front of his white coat with both hands, once the way his mother had taught him to smooth the front of his school uniform before he walked through a door that mattered. He looked at the deputy governor. "4th floor," the deputy governor said. "Yes," the doctor said. They walked to the elevator together. The doctor pressed the button. The elevator came. They got in. The doors closed. Emmanuel stood in the corridor alone. Yao had not moved. Sister Agnes had taken her hands off the counter and was now holding her elbows with the opposite hands, which was a different kind of stillness than the one she'd had before. The anticoagulation decision was made at 19:19 p.m., 28 minutes, inside the window. Dr. Mensa Ousu reviewed the post-operative imaging, consulted with the ICU attending physician, Dr. Ama Ose Bonsu, and initiated the protocol that the evidence supported. He wrote the order in the chart. He documented the timestamp. He washed his hands at the sink in the ICU and stood for a moment with water running over his wrists, the way he did when a case had gone to a place he had not expected it to go. Then he went to the family waiting room. Mrs. Darko Mensa was still there. She was 58 years old, and she had been in this waiting room for 4 hours and 53 minutes, and she had the look of a woman who had decided, at some point in the last 5 hours, that she was not going to fall apart. And who was holding to that decision, the way you hold to a decision you have made in a waiting room, with both hands. Very quietly, while the building breathes around you. The doctor sat down across from her. He sighed. Your husband came through the surgery well. The clot is gone. The imaging shows good reperfusion. We have initiated the protocol to protect that. The next 48 hours will tell us more. But where we are right now is a better place than where we were at 4:18 this afternoon. She looked at him. She said, You're the one who was on the floor. He said, Yes. She looked at her hands. Then she looked back at him. I sent him, she said. He said, I know. Thank you. She sighed. Are your glasses all right? It sighed they would need a new lens. She nodded. She looked at the wall. From the ICU, the sound of monitors, a steady, unhurried beeping that was the sound of a heart doing its work, persistent and unremarkable, the most ordinary, extraordinary thing a body does. She sighed. I'm going to make a phone call in the morning, he said. I imagine you are. The investigation into the incident took 11 weeks. The findings of the hospital's Patient Safety Board, the Regional Health Authority review, and the Independent Security Contractor audit were released jointly in a document dated the following March. The document was 94 pages. It established, among other findings, that Premier Security Services had deployed 23 personnel at Corlebu under a contract that contained no provision for medical emergency protocols, no training requirement for clinical environment procedures, and no escalation pathway for situations involving patient care. The contract had been renewed twice without modification. The officer responsible for approving the most recent renewal was a procurement administrator who had since retired and who was not named in the document but whose decisions were described in its third chapter in detail that left nothing to inference. Emanuela Safu Adhei was 27 years old and had been on the job for 4 months and had been given a protocol and a radio that worked intermittently, and no one had told him what to do when. The protocol and the patient were moving in opposite directions. He did not lose his employment. He completed a mandatory clinical environment safety program developed in partnership with the hospital's medical directorate, the first such program to be required of security contractors operating in Ghanaian hospitals. He completed it in 6 weeks. In his final assessment, he answered a scenario question about a physician without visible identification moving urgently through a restricted corridor. He wrote, I ask their name. I write it down. I walk with them. I never put them on the floor. The contract with Premier Security Services was not renewed. A new contract was issued to a different provider with modified requirements. The modification was 2 pages long. The first requirement on page 1 was, security personnel shall at no time physically restrain clinical staff in the execution of patient care duties. The hairline crack in the corridor tile on the ground floor was reported to facilities management on the Thursday morning following the incident. It was repaired by the following Monday. Dr. Mensa Ousu's glasses were replaced at his own expense. 240 cedis from the optician on Cantonments Road he had used since 2014. He did not submit the expense for reimbursement. He was asked by the deputy medical director whether he wished to. He said no. He said the glasses were his, and the cost was his. And what mattered was that the window had been 34 minutes when he stood up and 28 when he wrote the order, and the protocol had been initiated, and the governor had a 70 to 80% chance of full functional recovery, and that was the number that belonged to that night. Governor Chiampong Boateng was discharged from Corlebu Teaching Hospital on the 14th day after surgery. He walked out through the ground floor corridor under his own power at 11:23 a.m. on a Thursday. His wife was beside him. The surgical team was in the corridor. Dr. Mensa Owusu was at the end of the line, nearest the door. Because he had been running late from a morning consultation and had arrived after everyone else had taken their places, and he had gone to the end of the line because the end of the line was where? There was space. The governor stopped in front of him. He said, "I was told what happened in this corridor." Dr. Mensa Owusu said, "You needed the protocol." The protocol was initiated. The governor said, "That is not all that happened." The doctor said nothing. The governor looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I understand you would not want me to make this larger than it needs to be. I am going to make it exactly as large as it needs to be, and no larger. And I am going to start by asking what it would take to make this corridor safer for the next physician walking through it at 9 p.m. with a patient waiting." The doctor said, 2 pages of modifications to the security contract. Most of it is already written. The governor said, "Send it to my office." I sent it that afternoon. The contract modification was signed 11 weeks later. They have not spoken again. But the corridor is quieter now in the way that corridors become quieter when the things that were wrong with them have been identified and addressed rather than documented and filed. The crack in the tile is sealed. The new security provider's personnel have a laminated card in their breast pocket that tells them what to do when a physician is moving urgently toward a patient. The card is 1 page. The most important line is at the bottom, in bold. When in doubt, walk with them. What Emmanuel Asafu Adjei saw at 9:04 p.m. was a man in scrubs without a visible badge moving quickly through a restricted corridor after hours. What he could not see was 4 hours and 17 minutes of surgery, a 70 to 80% chance built by hand inside a skull. A mother's voice in 2009 saying, "Come back." 34 minutes on a clock that nobody in that corridor could afford to watch run out. What he could not see was the thing that was actually at stake because no one had ever given him a way to look for it. That is not entirely his failure. That is also the failure of every room where the contract was renewed without reading it, every meeting where the protocol was approved without testing it, every form that recorded what the guard did without asking what the guard had been prepared to do. You cannot hold the line if you were never shown where the line was. You cannot protect what you were never taught to recognize. And the people who write the contracts and sign the renewals and file the protocols in folders that nobody opens are not outside the story. They are the story. They are the crack in the tile that someone noticed and did not report for 7 years. Some things are fixed because a man ends up on the floor. Some things are fixed because a woman goes back up the stairs instead of to the coffee station. Some things are fixed because a deputy governor presses the down button instead of the parking button. And some things remain broken because the right person never ended up in the right corridor at the right moment to see what had been there all along. The next physician walking through that corridor at 9 p.m. will not be stopped. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. That is the corridor doing what it was always supposed to do. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. Here is the question I want to leave you with. Emmanuel was 27 years old and 4 months on the job, with a protocol and a radio that sometimes worked, and no one had ever told him what to do when the two things he was responsible for, security and patient care, moved in opposite directions. If you had written his training manual, what would the most important page have said? Not the rules. The one thing a young person holding a protocol card needs to understand before they walk into a building where people's lives are being held together by other people's decisions. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. I'll see you in the next one.